So thank you all for coming out. I'm David Aponovich. I am Director of Digital Experience at Acquia. Not so much on our own digital experience, running our digital experiences on our websites or our digital channels, but much more towards helping to explain what can sometimes be a complex technology based on Drupal to an increasingly business-savvy audience that may not have a lot of background in open source, or in the paradigm of what's changing right now in the software world, which is moving much more towards open systems, certainly cloud, all of these things that are now coming to fruition for enterprises that enable them to drive great digital experiences. Our tools, our technology is what helps them, so I help kind of show them the art of what's possible with the technology that we push into the market. My agenda today is going to go through a few things, and really part of the Acquia story and my story, I'll tell you how these have blended in the last few months. I'm relatively new to Acquia and frankly new to open source, so I probably stand among you with a lot to learn from the open source perspective, but probably a lot to give for companies who are either in the market of selling software that's open source based, or somehow involved in the software market and thinking about, well, how to overcome some of the problems or myths or FUD that gets put out in front of the open source technology, whatever you're involved in. So I'll go through kind of my open source moment of truth. I'll talk about open source as it rises through the stack, now to the level certainly of business applications, in my world, digital applications for web and online. What is Drupal, and against which vendors do we, as Acquia, compete? I'll talk about some of the common myths with some real examples from the market and how we help to counter them. And then we'll have, I think, a few minutes for Q&A towards the end. But where I come from probably is instructive for how this market's changing. I'm 90 days into Acquia, and I'd like to say 90 days into my open source career. I don't come from this market. I don't come from this world. So forgive me if I am still catching up. I come out of much more of a closed source or commercial software enterprise mentality that goes back more than a decade. I was, and frankly goes beyond that, I was an online publisher and editor for many years using these online tools. Typical commercial tools back in the day, Vignette, content management systems, and others that powered websites. I moved from there into marketing of these tools for a traditional .NET-based CMS company. I moved then into a digital agency. I spent 6 years helping to run web content management practice for a digital agency in Boston and Portland, Oregon, doing projects across, usually utilizing traditional commercial CMS platforms, content management platforms. And then I had a great opportunity, and I very much enjoyed it because of what it is. I joined Forrester Research about 2.5 years ago and helped to lead web content management research and digital experience technology research. It gave me a view on the market from the vendor side, just what's happening from technology and what's growing in this market, and the buyer side, the real users, who, whether it's an application development team or the marketers or generally the business, people who are saying, how can these tools help our business exceed what we're doing on the web today, and excel and meet new goals and engage with customers in new ways. And that's really the world I live in now at Acquia. I joined Acquia for the chance to see and help what I see as a disruptive company in a disruptive market bring a message to a new audience, which frankly is rising up the organizational stack towards the business leader in digital, or whether it's marketing or whether it's even C-level. My focus frankly is not towards the developer every day. So I live in this world of web CMS, web content management, and digital experience technology. And oh, by the way, definitionally, let me go back to that. This industry that I'm in, content management, has a little problem with acronyms. Web content management equals CMS equals WCM. If you're in this market, you get what I say, but if you're not, and I lapse into one or the other, it all means the same thing. I tend to maybe kind of conflate these all the time, but from a market perspective and from a tools perspective, they're all of the same family. So my open source moment of truth, and I use this as a trigger point to talk about kind of what opened my eyes to open source in a bigger way than it had been before, and started me, I think, on this journey towards open source and frankly bringing open source to new audiences. I did a report. It started out really almost a year ago researching into the growth of open source business applications that focus on web content management and broadly digital experience technologies. Anything that really helps organizations run the web, mobile, social, commerce aspects of their business. And I wrote this report, and it opened my eyes because I got access to some great leaders inside corporations who are doing great things. Whole Foods and Pfizer and Nissan and other organizations that are truly global and enterprise scale who are doing things with open source of a variety of tools and technologies at the business applications layer. Now I'm telling Acquia's story. I'll start by asking who uses Drupal as a technology, or who's at least familiar with Drupal as a platform for content management. Good, it's at least a good cross-section. Acquia, so Drupal is an open source framework, open source content management platform. The founder of the founder of Drupal, Dries Buytaert, who still leads the global community for developing Drupal, several years later, in the late 2007-8 timeframe, founded Acquia as a commercial company to help bring Drupal to the masses, to help bring Drupal to the enterprise. Has built around this Drupal-tuned cloud platform for delivering platform as a service and helping organizations get Drupal right as they move and find new opportunities to kind of bring this forward in the enterprise where traditional software has always been the ruler. So why I'm betting on Acquia and open source, and again, continuing this theme of what has opened my eyes and changed my mind about this and frankly convinced me that there's something going on here that I want to be part of. Certainly Drupal's growth in the agile enterprise. It's a massive scaling right now of Drupal into enterprises that traditionally may not have looked at open source or who may certainly have a predisposition to open source, but on both sides of that coin, we see growth. There's something for everybody in Drupal. I like to say that because it really hits the needs of application developers, of infrastructure and operations people, the people who are running the back end of operations, but also the front end people. I call them the business people, the digital marketing, or others who care about the customer experience. How are we building and delivering software on a platform that the business can use to engage with customers or prospects? Changes in enterprise software adoption. I look at this from a cost perspective, certainly. Cost being different than it is in the commercial world. I look at it too from deployment. We're moving much more, everybody is moving much more to the cloud, and I can't tell you the number as a researcher and analyst at Forrester how many business executives had told me over the past couple of years that their goal in the next 2 years was to move as much of their digital marketing applications to the cloud. And I came up with a concept which resonated with a lot of organizations, and frankly, it was an amalgam of what I'd been hearing, anywhere but here. So marketers had been going to their IT groups for so long saying, I want this, I want this, I want this. Well, suddenly, marketing has a lot more power, business has a lot more power and budget to make choices on their software. IT is getting to the point where they're happy to say, all right, let's put it somewhere but anywhere but here. Let's do something that's different because of this new way of deploying and accessing technology. The reallocation of software budgets is a big part of this, of course. With open source, you can start to rethink where you're putting your money or your budget and your time. And then this anti-lock-in approach. For so long, having been in the CMS market, had seen so many companies get locked in to what ended up for them being a bad decision that they could not unlock themselves from. My sense is, and what I like about the open source movement, and Drupal in particular, is that this is something that does not lock you in forever in a commercial way. It gives you flexibility from what you do with it, from where you have it living, what you can do to extend it, and how you tap the community resources or vendors to help bring it forward. And you can take that wherever you choose to go. Just as a point of fact, reference to, for what it's worth, analysts have started to pay attention to open source technology more than ever before. This certainly was true at Forrester. I'm happy to say that recently Gartner cited Acquia in the leader quadrant. I don't say it as a promotional thing as much as I say this is a milestone for open source and web content management. We see Gartner and others looking at open source technologies like Red Hat, many other companies that are now rating very well in Gartner Magic Quadrants, which tend to be a very a decision trigger that a lot of C-level CIOs and others use to make their purchasing decisions around big technology investments. So from an open source perspective, open source is on the map with the people who are at least creating thought leadership and driving opinions in the market, which is a positive thing to see. So quickly, what is Drupal? It's a unified open source platform for content, community, and commerce. It's been open source. It still is open source, and it will be open source. It's been around since about 13 years. What do we compete with? When we go to market, we're selling the Acquia platform, but it's built upon Drupal, and we leverage all aspects of Drupal. We compete against traditional web content management vendors, the likes of which you may use or you may know of through your organizations. Adobe, Sitecore, many legacy, I call them legacy because they've been around for a long time, web content management vendors like SDL or HP Autonomy, TeamSite, or Oracle. And there's a very long tail beyond that of CMS that's out there, as well as social business software is where we compete. I like to show this just because, as a quick aside, content management at its fundamental level helps organizations, the people on the front lines, edit, manage, create, and deploy content. I found this in a graveyard up near where I live in Massachusetts, 1700s gravestone, where I think it's the first sighting of a content management system, which really meant build it yourself, build it on your own, and use a chisel to change where you've screwed up the text on a gravestone, if you can see the mistake. Anyhow, but really this notion of combating and putting forward a story that says this is not open source is not, open source is ready for prime time. We see it reflected in companies like GE that have moved this way, the NBC that has moved towards open source with Drupal, towards Warner Music Group that has built hundreds of sites on Drupal. It gets over the sense that this is not ready for prime time on an enterprise scale, and it's part of the message that we're bringing to market to show that, through stories, through data, that the perception that this is not enterprise ready is not true. So I look at momentum and I think about open source all the way down, right? My historic view had been about these other sectors of the technology market, of developer-centric areas where open source was gaining steam. And the bottom, digital experience applications, is where a lot of my research had focused, that this is the growth area, at least for where I focus and look at. I like to see this because it really shows the expansion and the momentum of open source in the enterprise. Data from Forrester shows open source is growing. This is more when it comes to kind of educating people we talk to on where is it going, who else is doing it. Data shows that 38% of organizations say they're going to invest more heavily in open source in the next year. These are the kind of data points that, from a baseline, I start with when I'm speaking to people who just don't understand the open source software application market. As part of my research, I looked at the business applications that we find out there. And frankly, in a whole bunch of the digital experience categories for software, we find some very successful, growing open source projects that are now taking over and helping to build this ecosystem around an open source digital experience ecosystem. And it gives organizations quite a few new chances to consider open source elsewhere in the enterprise. This other one too is something. It's a concept that I've come up with to think about how organizations need to shift in this age of digital, where organizations are trying to do better, digitally transform, better address their customers, prospects, or whoever else they touch through the web, online. And this notion of IT versus BT is something I've done some research into, and I think is very relevant to the open source world, and frankly relevant to the products that we bring to market. The concept here is that traditionally IT, information technology teams, have done a great job at delivering software applications to the business to help them run. For 40 years, they've done a great job. Everything from supply chain management to all the back office applications like financials to HR, ERP systems. This is the world of traditional IT, and much more than that, of course. But they've done a great job at focusing on that. And along the way, they've kind of come up with, and they've kind of built a structure around how they think, how they act, how they operate when it comes to adopting this technology. If you can't read it on the left side, it really looks at what is the IT traditional mindset. It's an inward focus on back-end apps. It's very disciplined and slow in terms of their traditional process. It's thinking about, their deployment model tends to be on-premise infrastructure, traditional licensed software, and high levels of security. All of this is good. All of this is real. There's nothing wrong with this. But in the world where organizations, at least the world I sit in, they're trying to pivot towards a much more nimble, agile, digital future, this mindset of business technology, or a different way of thinking of how to adopt, deploy, and manage digital technology comes into play, and I call it business technology. The concept here that it's a sidestep from IT over to BT, business technology, where you're thinking customer and digital first. For some organizations, this means they're implementing and building teams of BT or business technologists who have a mindset aligned with the new digital organization as companies change. It thinks much more nimbly. It thinks much more agile about how they're going to market to build these new applications. Open source fits very well the model of what they're doing. And when I look at this, I think, well, outward focus on digital technology, that's part of this business technology shift. Agile or fast sourcing of software tools for digital engagement certainly supports the notion that with open source you can try things, iterate quickly, and try again. Cloud-based infrastructure and applications. We at Acquia are built on the cloud. Many other of the open source business applications that are out there are cloud-based. This is where enterprise software is moving to. Security balanced with speed, risk tolerant. These are all the traits of the new business technology organization that's coming up within many enterprises to drive this agenda forward. It separates itself from IT, and it gives itself some more flexibility. It almost sits between IT and the business, and gives, I think, the organization much more flexibility and nimbleness as they think about next generation technologies. Open source, I believe, fits this paradigm very well to enable companies to move forward very fast. So having come out of the commercial software world for quite a long time and looking at it that way, I kind of put myself in their shoes and say, all right, here's how they think. They think, and their go-to-market or their approach to technology has simply been, hey, we're going to package a bunch of software and we're going to throw lots of technology at the enterprise buyer for business applications that run their digital enterprise. So this is a snapshot of really our competitive set, broadly speaking, at Acquia, with other companies that are in this market as well. Adobe, I would consider it really web content management-based companies or e-commerce-based companies and big software companies, right? And this shows across the last 4 or 5 years this multitude of acquisitions that companies have had as they've tried to build a much wider footprint, a much wider portfolio to sell into organizations. This has not been bad. This has been interesting to see happen. Companies like Adobe have done a very interesting job putting together a wide and deep set of technologies to address, in their case, the digital marketer. Other companies like IBM have done a good job at acquiring technologies that help enable the broader digital enterprise. Nothing wrong with this approach. But what I found through research is that a lot of organizations that are doing this, that are buying technologies, are still having and will for a long time have trouble integrating, making it work together from a UI perspective, from a data perspective, and from a development tools perspective. What happens is we've gotten into a point now, at least in the technology of this world that I'm in, digital technology, web content management, digital experiences, almost a factional war between assembling great experience technology with best-of-breed tools versus buying something like a marketing suite or a marketing cloud, which a lot of these vendors are now calling their portfolios. But what's really happening down in the trenches at the development level, at the application, the people who are buying applications, they're figuring out that the notion of buying a box around all this software is not working because of the reasons I just said. They're not well integrated. They're not well aligned from a UI perspective. Customers still are looking for a much more focus on best-of-breed technologies, a foundational technology like web content management that will then work in concert with things around it. This is really where I think, from a future state where organizations should be thinking, not to be self-serving, but Drupal as a content management and a hub for content and for experience around which can be arrayed all kinds of software and technologies that may be open source, that may be commercial, but which plug in a very easy way through API, through modules, through integration, and let organizations figure out for themselves what is going to work best as they go forward building this next generation digital platform. And I believe that the open source movement provides this much more strongly than any of the commercial software that's out there today, the vendors that are out there. The openness, equals value for the companies that are actually paying a lot of money to buy software today, or paying a lot to have someone construct this type of ecosystem for them. So now this often gets into, and this is where I've been spending a lot of my time in the last few months, is figuring out, okay, where is the competitive threat, or where is the, let's call it what it is, the FUD or the myths coming out against Drupal and Acquia in a world that has been really dominated by commercial software vendors in the past few years. And how do they compete against us with, with evidence or threats against what we do? So FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, common in the open source world. This is an example from a digital agency that does a lot of work with proprietary CMS. In our world, we look at this and say, well, everything here is going, this is a flow chart that they put together for potential customers and organizations. All roads lead to the commercial systems that they happen to do. This is not uncommon to see, but it just happens to work out that way. Great example. So here are some 5 myths that we'll go through about Drupal, and really this applies to open source in many ways. So myth number 1, Drupal is just for blogs and simple sites and not global enterprises. It's very easy to throw stones at any vendor. I tend not to like to throw stones at other vendors. I'd rather hit on the positives of what our technology and Drupal as an open source community can do. But we see it a lot from vendors who are talking about unsubstantiated claims, the things that you see out there probably in your community, whether it's Drupal or another community of open source that you're involved in, blanket statements that really don't have any teeth. So my sense is, at least in the practice that we're doing, is kill them with kindness and with data and some evidence. I like to, certainly I like to show who is using the technology, open source technology and Drupal technology. Drupal is dominant in the enterprise. These are the type of things that quickly offset these arguments and say, okay, we get over the hump at least first where organizations are, competitors are telling customers that this will not work for you as an enterprise. From a data perspective, we look at the open source data, at least the data for Drupal in our world, and using, in this case, we use built with as just a simple metric to find out, well, who is using technology that competes with us and we compete with. From a data perspective, we look at the numbers and we see that for some of the leading vendors in this space, the commercial vendors, down the bottom, Drupal is far and away from a percentage of the top 100,000 sites in many more sites, running many more sites. This is the kind of data that gets people over the hump too. Myth number 2, Drupal isn't secure. Drupal isn't secure, and really open source isn't secure is really a big myth. Again, unsubstantiated things that come out, and frankly, there's a lot of things that happen that point to the fact that open source communities can combat this and get through it. Number 1, I'll point to the fact that a lot of high security sites or necessary security run on Drupal. The White House runs on Drupal. Other organizations, pharmaceutical companies, and others believe in their world that this is the most secure place for their data, for their content, for their experiences. Many government sites, etc. I will, though, we can get into, and I'd like to bring up a colleague to describe very quickly, an episode that's really fresh off the news about a security threat to Drupal, and it shows in our world how we substantiated and fixed a security threat as not just an organization of Acquia, but as a community of open source developers who attacked a problem, fixed it, and got back to business. So I'd like to introduce Eric Webb from Acquia, who's going to kind of go through what happened just a week ago in this community.
So about a week ago, there's a fairly serious security vulnerability that came out against Drupal. I think the interesting part for the sake of this talk is rather than looking at this as all of a sudden something was available out in the wild and everyone was chasing it down, a big part of the coordination that happened in the Drupal community was about 3 or 4 of the biggest Drupal hosts are all part of a coordinated Drupal security team. So this Drupal security team has a lot of tenets of they're working in-house, solving the problem before they're releasing anything out to kind of the 0-day vulnerability category. So Acquia included, as well as some of our other companies that do Drupal hosting, actually already had security fixes in place before the vulnerability was ever announced in any way. So this wasn't something Acquia owned. This wasn't something that one development shop owned out there, this was something that the entire Drupal community was able to latch onto and really support very broadly. Rather than a single commercial vendor that would put this fix out there and then everyone's scrambling to figure it out, a very well-coordinated security team that is out in the community can actually get ahead of a lot of these problems. So on our platform, it was patched before it was ever released, a couple other big vendors, and we've seen hundreds of thousands of attempts at it on our hosting, and we've been able to deflect all of them because we were ahead of it and we had that type of coordination.
Great, thank you. I think what Eric points to is this idea of community, of coordination, of working together, which simply isn't seen in the commercial world in any degree to what we're talking about here. By necessity, the Drupal community comes together all the time to extend and to build on top of, but also to solve issues like this before they become issues. And I think this is also kind of this changing paradigm of open source software and how organizations are thinking about, well, who will they source technology from? I think this is just one of those examples that show, this is something that is that matters to organizations, and it can be, from an enterprise perspective, safe and secure. Quickly, I'll go through a few more myths. Open source won't scale to handle the world's largest sites. This is something we hear every day from the vendors who also compete in a commercial way against us. The scalability comprises a lot of factors in our world. We like to show that there's open source powering enterprises at massive scale across many different categories. Whether it's digital experience from Acquia or big data, or databases or operating systems. I mean, this is for organizations who are naive to it or don't quite understand it, proof positive that this is happening at an enterprise scale. In our world of helping to run websites, scale means traffic oftentimes. Acquia runs the Grammy Awards site, and on one day a year, it's the most trafficked site in the world when they have their telecast. This goes off without a problem because it's a scalable platform that works. Similarly, the MTA in New York City runs on this. This is scalable. This is showing more proof that this will work for the largest enterprises out there. And Weather Channel, weather.com, another example that we point to of scale where this is a top 25 website in the world running on open source technology. And again, I think this is helping to overcome the sense that this is not ready to scale. The next myth really goes around tribal knowledge and the idea that it requires a well-supported community of developers. And this is true, frankly. We find that the most successful organizations have a good team internally that can work on Drupal and understand Drupal. But frankly, it goes well beyond the walls of their organization to the Drupal community at large. There are 30,000 some members of the Drupal, I think, contributing development to Drupal, a smaller group contributing to the core. But there's this massive global footprint of people who are always constantly contributing to, and I like to think of it as this concentrated innovation that's constantly going into Drupal, which benefits the companies that are using it together. So it is the largest open source platform in the world as far as market presence and community. And I think this is one of those points that organizations that have not looked at open source tend to be quite surprised when they see the depth and the breadth of who's contributing, what they're doing, and how this is working. And we also point to the fact that for growth, for innovation, the size of the community adds a lot of speed to otherwise what tends to be a slower moving market with technology. And the idea that this vast number of developers or others who contribute to the core platform and to additional things like modules or add-ons or plugins can make the innovation go much, much faster than a traditional proprietary CMS vendor. And then finally, Drupal is more expensive. The whole cost issue, I tend not to love the cost issue because when you tell someone Drupal is free, and they don't understand what open source is, they tend to not quite understand what it means to be free. We like to think of free as one place that you can not put your money into the software license, but also you put it, or frankly, you reallocate your funds to things that are much more strategic in nature, and you move forward. So we do see competitive threats or competitive commentary from other vendors that talk about time to market, cost to get to market, things like that. This is quite fungible information. It's hard to pin down when it comes to an argument like this, but suffice to say that I like to say that when it comes to a cost perspective, the shifting of dollars and the shifting of funds and the shifting of time where your effort goes is a conversation that we like to have with organizations to get over this idea that, well, what is more expensive, what is less expensive? It doesn't quite boil down to easy numbers like that. And there's plenty of this stuff out there around kind of competitive costs and TCO that we tend to combat with, but really everyone's mileage varies and there's a lot of factors that go into the overall cost things. We found savings, we point to savings and use data, again, to back up our assertions around cost savings rather than cost to implement, and talk about how organizations, in this case, the state of Georgia, is saving money by moving to open source. These are extra myths that we hear about. I won't dive into them today, but in your projects or your open source world, whatever you might be working on, you've probably seen these type of things too. So let's wrap it up. I think this, Dries Buytaert, who founded Drupal and also founded Acquia, likes this quote because I think it solidifies in his mind the momentum and the direction of an open source project, whether it's Drupal or other things. I think if we go back several years, sorry about that. We think about how, and I think this quote captures everything. First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and I think we're in that mode now where commercial vendors who are threatened by open source are fighting it, and then you win. I'd like to think that there's a middle ground here where all of the open source projects that are out there continue to find solid footing in their markets, us included, but certainly there are many other people in this room working on their own individual, different communities or different projects that are all moving forward, gaining scale and gaining followers. I'd like to think that this is really the future of software. This is where companies are going, thinking about it. This is where open source projects are going to support the enterprise. And I think, this idea of winning, I think this is quite possible. I'd like to see, I look forward to kind of getting more immersed in the community of open source, Drupal and others, as I go forward here, but I think it's a positive time to see this all happening. So I'll leave it at that, and we'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Any other questions?
I'm curious where you receive the most pushback when you go to a company with an open source offering. Is it like from the marketing department or is it like usually IT departments?
Sometimes it's both. I'd say it starts in the marketing department or the business, whoever that business person is, who has some predisposed idea that open source is one of those things, right? It's either not secure, or it's it's not scalable, or it's not something. Often, though, it is in the technology world, right? People have real concerns about it if their job is built around a Microsoft infrastructure or a Java infrastructure, and we're coming in and saying, Drupal is PHP, and you're going to have to rethink how you do your technology stack. They have probably legit concerns for themselves. I'd like to think, from a technology perspective, we can overcome on a factual basis the benefits of moving towards this direction. I think it's much more personal when we find the arguments from the technology side. I don't know if you've got any similar experiences too, but.
Yeah, so I work in a consulting shop where we do like tech stuff, but we never deal with the IT department because like they come to us because their IT department can't do it. So we've actually got like a really easy job like getting open source stuff done. Like, they go to their proprietary internal IT teams who can't do anything, so they hire us. So for us, like, it's been a very easy job to actually implement open source with our clients.
Mm-hmm. And what type of open source technologies do you focus on?
All of them. Like, we do Node, Rails, we do that stuff. We haven't done too much Python stuff, and then front end, like every single framework there is.
Yep.
So, we have done some Drupal stuff, but we've kind of moved out of the content management kind of stuff into more of the business application, internal tooling.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Yeah.
So in terms of your experience so far, which sectors have sort of seen a big spike in growth in terms of being more open to open source?
Yeah, I think government is a great example. Certainly that's where a lot of heritage has been for open source, at least in this world of content management and digital tools. The open data projects that are happening across many federal governments are driving a lot of adoption there. the country of Australia is standardizing on Drupal. All government is standardizing on Drupal as, because they're moving towards open source. I think that's one of many countries that are kind of thinking that way and moving in that direction. Higher education's always had a good foothold with Drupal, or at least Drupal's had a foothold in higher education for good reason. But we're seeing too, traditional industries like financial services. Many organizations are rethinking kind of this traditional software, traditional commercial model for how they get these applications and moving towards open source. And really, there's not a market that we don't work in, but we're certainly seeing hotspots in areas like that. Yeah.
So, sort of jumping onto this question here, we face the same situation, and similarly, they come to us because our IT department can't deliver.
Mm-hmm.
My question is actually about sort of things you're seeing in hosting approval. We tend to, the companies come to us and say, we don't want to split our IT department with a hosting piece either, can you just help us out with that? And so I know one of the things you said is that very often the pushback is as well, we're a .NET shop, and maybe we're not prepared to put PHP on our Windows, boxes. Where's the trends going to be? And I see you guys are also in the hosting game. Where are people putting Drupal more often than not these days?
From where do they host it?
Yeah.
That's it. So we do a lot of it. There are a number of companies out there that also host. Some do it internally too. There's a broad spectrum of that. I don't know if you've got some better insight into, I don't know percentages or how we're seeing it deployed, but maybe Eric has some more
So
data.
I think to me, the biggest gap is a lot of companies that host Drupal internally, or any other PHP application for that matter, tend to host a PHP application very strictly. They don't look at it from the standpoint of what other cloud services can we integrate? How does the deployment workflow? What does continuous integration fit into it? So I think a lot of the in-house hosting of Drupal and applications like that tend to be the same companies that don't look forward to continuous integration in that model of development. They look at it more of, we do a release, we test it, we push it out. I think those two kind of go hand in hand, where, if you just want to turn on Apache and PHP, you can run Drupal, right? You can just turn it on, it works. But how do you actually ship things between environments? How do you copy databases between them? How do you actually work on some kind of branching continuous integration flow? I think that's actually more material to where someone hosts than are they using Drupal, or are they using Java, or are they using whatever else. That's the part that I think traditional IT has an even more difficult part, is the idea that you could release something 3 times a day. I think that's more of the scary concept.
I think we have time for one more question before 12 o'clock. Anyone? No? Well, thank you very much for all coming out. I'll let you go to lunch. Thank you.